say thank you.
Sorry.
You're good. I'm interrupted by AI all the time. So yeah. So thank you all so much for having me. I am very honored and feel very fortunate to have this platform with you all today. And yeah, this was a topic that I kind of ran into by accident. As Christian mentioned, I'm an author, I'm a writer, and it was when I was actually trying to start writing a book that was like autobiography, almost like a paranormal version of Eat, Pray, Love. And as I was writing it and kind of mapping out and timelining everything like that happened in my life in terms of the paranormal and significant events that had happened in my life in between, I noticed there was a correlation between traumatic events in my life and my paranormal experiences. So I do want to preface, though, I am not a mental health specialist. I took a couple of psychology classes in college, but that's about where my knowledge ends. I'm currently doing more exploration into this topic from a mental health standpoint, from a more of a scientific standpoint. I need to talk to people smarter than me in that department, though, to really get to dive in deeper. So this is basically the start of a research adventure or research project that I'm doing on this topic. So thank you all for listening, and I would love to hear your thoughts at the end as well, because I think this is something that we don't quite talk about really, especially when we're looking at the ghost hunting community and the paranormal community. I think there is something significant here that we should be exploring. So I'll go ahead and get rolling. Let's see. So just a little bit about me in case you're wondering who am I. I'm originally from San Diego. I currently live in Raleigh, North Carolina in the USA. I did live in the UK for about 9 months. I studied in Oxford at Balliol College in 2007 when I was studying abroad. And I got my MA in theater arts from San Diego State University with an emphasis on Shakespeare and looking at theater from an anthropological and a sociological perspective. Let's see, as mentioned, I've written about 4 books now about the paranormal. I'm currently working on another one. So my first publication was released in 2014, with the latest one being 2019. In my day job, I am an instructional designer or a learning experience designer, depending on who you talk to in the industry. And I work for a major tech company. So I'm basically teaching our sellers how to sell computers. And I am also a social media influencer at the handle The Spooky Stuff, which is basically what I do after I clock off for the day after I'm done with work. So that's just a little bit about me. Let's see. So as I mentioned, while I was writing my ghost version of Eat, Pray, Love, title pending, it's not going to be Eat, Pray, Love ghost version. So significant events in my life. December 1992, my grandfather died. And then in January of 1993, I moved in with my grandma. I was extraordinarily close with my grandpa. He was somebody that meant a lot to me. He was the main father figure in my life at the time. So about 8 months after his death, that was when I had my first significant paranormal event. This was the paranormal event that you could say that sparked my interest in the field. It was a dark and stormy night in a little town called Catlettsburg, Kentucky, which is also where my grandfather is buried. And I looked outside on the dark and stormy night out in the country in the Appalachian mountains of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. So we're talking really rural. And I saw a hooded figure outside of the house, outside of my great grandmother's house. I ran into bed, put the covers over me because that's how we keep the monsters from getting us. And the bed that I was sleeping on was very firm, like so firm in the fact, and this is an old cheap mattress, it didn't sink when you got into bed, it tipped. So sometimes getting into bed was a bit of an adventure because it's like climbing up a slide. And I got into bed. Sometimes my great grandmother would come and sleep with me in the bed in case I got scared. And so I was expecting her to come, sleep with me because it was a dark and stormy night. And the bed did tip. And I was like, oh, well, here's my mama. She's coming to sleep with me. And I slid off the bed. And as I got up and I looked at the bed tipped back to normal. So almost like someone had been sitting there, and then they got up and the bed went back to normal. And then it wasn't too long after that, in December 1993, I had another significant paranormal event involving getting smacked on the head, on the forehead, in my house in San Diego. I was laying on one of the guest beds, looking up at the ceiling, no shelves above me, just looking up the ceiling, and it felt like something smacked me on my forehead, just a pop. Again, nothing to explain that. And fast forward about 10 years, I started homeschooling in fall 2003. It was my senior year of high school, which was a big change. I basically started homeschooling to join a performance group, but also I was failing high school at this point. And I had gone through some trauma in the year 2000. So homeschooling was a major change for me, especially when I started having regrets about homeschooling and I wanted to go back to public school, but it wasn't possible. So spring 2004, I had a third significant paranormal event, which a lot of people can attribute it to sleep paralysis, but in this case, I was awake. I had the sleep paralysis sensation, but I was awake. And I hadn't gone to sleep. If I had gone to sleep and woken up, I would be like, yeah, it's sleep paralysis, but I hadn't gone to sleep yet. And then New Year's Eve 2005, I had gotten into a major car accident. Basically, it was raining New Year's Eve. My car hydroplaned on a freeway ramp. When I got out of the car to get my stuff, another car came and hit me. I fell 25 feet onto the asphalt below, so I landed on the road below. And I had internal bleeding, vertically sheared my pelvis, broke 3 vertebrae in my back, shattered my tailbone. And this photo is actually my mother and I. This was about a week after the accident, but you see I have a head injury there. There's other injuries, but I'm going to spare you those graphic photos. But yeah, so I ended up having surgery to repair my hip because basically my pelvis had broken in half. And that signified my fourth significant paranormal event. If you watch Haunted Hospitals, the story was featured on Haunted Hospitals recently on TV. There was some dramatic liberties taken with it, but overall they stayed true to the story. This was probably my fourth most significant event out of my previous experiences. Which I do try to go back and debunk it to this day. I had been sharing a trauma room that night with another individual who ended up dying that night. I had an out-of-body experience on the night of my car accident while I was in the hospital. There was another person in the room with me. We were both looking at our bodies on the table, and I came back to my body. He didn't. So I ended up seeing him for several months after that car accident. So, and it seemed to intensify as I got better and as I recovered. So there's a whole thing here, a lot to unload. But I'm not gonna dive in too deep right now because it's a lot. it's a lot. But then there's some other considerations for this as well, something to keep in mind for me. So this is a photo of my great grandmother's house. This was where I had my first paranormal experience, the first paranormal event. I was diagnosed with a developmental disability when I was young. Doctors told my mother that I probably wouldn't graduate high school. Joke's on them, I got a master's degree. I also had abusive parental figures. My parents had a very volatile relationship with each other, and they took it out on me. I was also introduced to death very early on. My grandfather died when I was about 7 years old. And then not too long after that, my grandmother died when I was 14. I was 14, so about 7 years later. But and death has kind of been a constant in my life, and I'm not talking about from a paranormal perspective. Most of my family is dead now. So it's something that has been a part of my life for quite some time. Between family members dying, friends dying, fiancés dying. Yeah, death has been a constant in my life. As I mentioned, to go along with abusive parental figures, I was living in a very controlling and combative household with extreme religious ideology. My mother was a very conservative Christian, extremely conservative. My grandmother, not quite so much, but that caused a lot of discord between my mom and my grandmother. So I was exposed to a lot of conflict at an early age. And I was seeing a child therapist as well. So I just unloaded a lot of my life story to you all. And as I've been exploring, wrong screen. As I've been exploring this chapter of my life that's been kind of it's been a bit of an adventure trying to look up more information about this. I've been noticing as I've been researching trauma and paranormal beliefs, I'm seeing a lot of articles that are like correlation between trauma and paranormal beliefs, or the connection between childhood abuse and paranormal experiences. And when I look at that and I read the abstracts, because that's all I really have access to at this time. I'm going to splurge on some memberships in a few months. It's been, as somebody who has believed in the paranormal for most of their life, as somebody who, wants proof of the afterlife, believes, but wants some proof. So I hesitate to call myself a skeptic or a believer, or a skeptical believer, because I just always have questions. But as I've been reading the abstracts for these journals, I'm finding myself seeing myself in these reports and these journals, and I'm like, well, okay, so there's something going on here. There's something going on here, and it's not to the point where it's made me like question the validity of my experiences, but it's made me wonder exactly how has my brain been interpreting, the trauma that I've been through, and the grief that I've been through. Because there has been a lot of grief in my life, not just trauma, but grief. So I found, I'm going to try to pull this up the best I can, because I have to pull up, I'm on my work computer, don't tell my job. Yeah, so I think this is something that we need to explore more, because it's also made me really, so I do have a paranormal team. I run a paranormal team where we are going into people's homes, and we are, talking to people about their experiences. And I've also noticed this correlation between my, clients who bring us in and their trauma and their grief that they go through. So, so basically the study, the significant correlation between trauma and paranormal beliefs, this study interviewed 198 graduate students, and they found that there was a significant link here. So basically really diving into coping strategies of the undergraduate students, and basically their response to trauma. So and this also included like fantasy proneness. They study childhood trauma, of course. So coping style, stigma, resiliency. Yeah, so I found it really fascinating. And if you hear my cat meow, I do apologize. She's very vocal when I start talking.
Unfortunately, but this is what you can read it. So I mean, yeah, mental health.
All right. So now I also am somebody who considers themselves a study of pagan practices. Some people may say I'm a witch. I do spell work. Yeah. And of course, then I found this one, Witchcraft Strong and Those with History of Abuse. Again, it's one of, just like with the other journal, I was like, okay, I see myself here. And I too have, I don't know how strong my beliefs are in psi and precog and spiritualism personally. I can't really speak, I can only speak for myself in this, that I can agree though that there is a link of regaining control and being in control of your own destiny and whatnot. So, and I'll be happy to share these sources with you all too, as well, if you want to dive in. So let's see. So I decided to so I started looking inward with myself and my trauma, grief, and whatnot. And I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going through this and potentially my clients are going through this too, and there are enough people to be going through this that there are journals being written about this topic, let's expand and see where else are we exploring this. And the belief in the supernatural it's old. I mean, it's been around since, gosh, yeah, it's old, basically. This is my very simplistic explanation of that. So my area of expertise and study when I was getting my master's was in like Shakespeare, Elizabethan England. So, you know, I was looking at Marlowe and Johnson quite a bit, and how often they used witches, ghosts, and the occult in Shakespeare, Marlowe, Johnson, and those plays. So ghosts are very common plot devices in stories. And so we have to consider historical context and what was going on in those periods of times when I'm looking at plays, when they're written. So expanding that beyond theater, I'm looking at legends and lore, and potential ghost sightings that were happening in Elizabethan England, and what was happening in that period of time too. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm finding some correlations here, where I'm seeing, looking into trauma throughout history. Now, it's obviously a very big topic. So if we go into something like the spiritualism movement. The spiritualism movement was, you could say it was a drive for feminism. You had women who were mediums that were stepping up and finding themselves in leading roles, so to speak. I've studied the theatricality of spiritualism. It's extremely fascinating. As well as the performance of like ghost hunting and whatnot. And I can always go into that later. But anyway, so the spiritualism movement, not only was that driven by grief and trauma, especially during and after the Civil War, it was also a place for women basically taking more of a leadership role and becoming more than just a housewife or a mother or a sister or a daughter. They were really starting to be more prominent. And also the spiritualism movement consisted of members of marginalized groups. And, there was a strong connection between spiritualists and abolitionists. And all of this you could say, is a response to trauma and grief, whether that's the Civil War or we're talking about slavery, which I think is interesting to look at from that lens. So when you look at ghost stories in general, I mean, Japanese lore, especially coming from feudal Japan, a lot of significant events happening there. Revolutionary War. We have a lot of ghost stories relating to the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the Victorian era, even with like Charles Dickens. I mean, his were fictionalized, but some argue that Dickens inspired some true ghost stories, so to speak, where the story got told over and over again and kind of became true of its own. And then we have ghost stories associated, especially in the United States. I can only speak for the US, World War II. Out over here in the US, battlefields, Civil War, Revolutionary War battlefields are especially popular places to investigate. In terms of World War II, aircraft carriers, battleships, those are very popular places to do paranormal investigations. Again, these were all significant, locations for trauma, wartime stress. Yeah, so now, then it's like, do we look at it from, okay, well, the stress and the trauma and the grief, that is energy that, that came out during those periods of time, and then they remain, and that's what we're investigating? Or is it us meaning paranormal investigators, or is it us trying to make sense of these chapters of our history and make peace with them in some form or another? Especially when people are investigating, like plantations, cemeteries. Is that our own way of processing some sort of trauma or grief? So I tend to tell people now that ghost hunting is my way of grieving, meaning I'm still trying to process the loss that I've had in my life. Could my personal experiences be explained by, from a psychological standpoint? Probably. And I am open to that. I mean, the experiences are still very much real to me, but sorry about that. Yeah. So, and plus when I'm dealing with the experiences of others, and I'm hearing about what they've been going through, we tend to ask our clients, like, is this falling on any sort of anniversary, or was there a death in the family? Anything significant in your life? And we've had clients who have been dealing with pregnancy loss lately, and they've been really having a hard time with it. And then these paranormal events start manifesting. When the COVID lockdowns started with the pandemic and whatnot, people were in their homes way more than they were used to. And my team and I had an uptick in reports. We were being contacted by, like, I'd say 3 times the amount of people that we usually get in contact with. So some of it, we were like, well, okay, maybe this is just a response to the pandemic, and people are home more often and they just don't know what their house is like. We have a saying on my team that goes like, we're learning the language of the house, or we're learning the language of the property. Meaning, like, if we're in an old house, we want to know what is making it sound like someone's moving, or someone's walking on the second floor. Okay, well, it's the floorboards. Or if we think we're hearing taps on the walls, it's just the house settling. So learning the language of the house. And we were thinking a lot of our cases were people learning the language of their house and not knowing what the language was. So, but also we realized this uptick in reports were a response to stress. I mean, with the pandemic, there was a lot of unknown variables happening there. And I mean, for the first couple of weeks after lockdown, I was sanitizing my grocery bags, when I came home. So there's the pandemic, and the lockdowns are incredibly stressful. And I don't know if the uptick in cases wasn't just because people were home or people were around their homes more often. I think it might have been something deeper. And I also think ghost hunting has become, and especially people wanting an investigation or wanting us to come in and hunt their homes, it's a coping mechanism. It gives them a sense of validation, and they're trying to find connections to the traumatic events that have happened to them and try to make sense of them. Because it's more difficult to accept the idea that these things just happen. There has to be a rhyme or reason behind it, that sort of thing. So yeah, so this is really just the beginning of my research into this venture. So, and actually, I think this might be my last slide. Yes, it is. So, yeah, so I am open to Any comments, questions? This is basically my presentation. It's a short one. It's a short one, but I am just in the beginnings of this, and I've